June 8th, 1967. Israel is in the midst of the 6 Days War against her Arabian neighbors. The U.S., Israel's strongest ally, had declared its neutrality in the war, as had several Western countries like Britain and France, over fears of provoking the Soviet Union and escalating the conflict into another world war, leaving Israel to fight alone. Off the coast of the Sinai, an American ship, the USS Liberty, is sailing through the Mediterranean in international waters. The Liberty had been overflown several times that morning by Israeli aircraft, close enough for the crew of the Liberty and the pilots to clearly identify one another and exchange waves. Around 2 p.m. that evening, another pair of Israeli planes approached the Liberty, this time not simply recon aircraft, but attack jets. The events that follow would become one of the most controversial moments of not only the Cold War, but of modern history.
I, for one, know that our flag was flying, and I know for a fact that it would be right.
Many of the guys that were topside said that after we took the torpedo and the torpedo boats kind of just milled around, we threw our last two inflatable life rafts in the water, and the torpedo boats came over and machine gun holes in the life rafts.
In the Middle East, the spirit of goodwill toward all, unfortunately, has not yet taken hold.
The Liberty was a highly modified World War II era Victory cargo ship, which in and of itself was essentially a larger design of the Liberty cargo ship. She was modified into a technical research ship, which is a really fancy way of saying spy ship. Publicly, these ships were conducting research into communications technology and atmospheric phenomena. In reality, ships like the Liberty would sail around the world and collect communication and intelligence on national security matters. The Liberty herself was acquired by the Navy as the Simmons Victory in 1963. They converted her into a miscellaneous auxiliary ship and renamed her USS Liberty. After being outfitted for her intelligence-gathering mission, she was sent to the coast of West Africa in 1965. Over the next couple of years, she successfully carried out her mission, which brings her to the Mediterranean Sea after Israel's preemptive strike on Egypt, sparking the 6 Days War in 1960. The Liberty is sailing through international waters in the Mediterranean Sea on a signal intelligence collection mission. While ashore, the 6-day war rages between Israel and her Arabian neighbors. The United States is maintaining neutrality in the conflict. That very morning, the Liberty had been overflown by various Israeli aircraft several times, close enough for the pilots and crew to exchange waves and clearly identify one another. Due to these flyovers, Liberty's location and neutrality status had been marked and recorded by the Israelis. Later that evening, around 2 p.m., a pair of Israeli Mirage jets approached the Liberty and, instead of flying over her, immediately strafed her with their 30mm guns. The crew, having just completed a chemical attack drill, were in stand-down mode, with both their helmets and life jackets removed. In the first run, 8 crewmen were killed or fatally wounded, while 75 were injured. Captain McGonigal, who was injured in the first attack run, sent a call for help to 6th Fleet. Quote, "Under attack by unidentified jet aircraft, require immediate assistance." The pair of Mirages continued to strafe the Liberty with their cannons and rockets until they had expended all of their munitions. A pair of Dassault Supermystères replaced the 2 Mirages, each armed with napalm bombs. Both dropped their bombs on Liberty, setting the deck and most of the superstructure on fire. One of the pilots was confused about the lack of return fire from the ship they were actively bombing. Flying closer to try and identify the ship, he saw no flag being flown. This was due to Liberty's flagpole being destroyed in the initial attack, but he did notice her hull marking, which read GTR-5. The Latin markings meant one of two things. The ship was either American or Soviet. At the time, the Israelis thought they were attacking an Egyptian support ship. While the Egyptians were known to try and disguise their ships as Western ships, they usually didn't go as far as marking their ships with Latin markings. When this information was relayed back to Israeli command, the order to stop the attack was immediately given. After the halt to the air attack, the crew of the Liberty raised a large American flag and began damage control measures. Around this time, too, the initial distress call had been received by 6th Fleet, and 8 aircraft from USS America had been dispatched, but were recalled just minutes after. However, the attack wasn't over. Israeli torpedo boats were sighted around 2:20 p.m. heading toward the Liberty, and according to McGonigal were, quote, approaching the ship in a torpedo launch attitude. The torpedo boat stopped roughly 6,000 meters from the Liberty and signaled her to identify herself on both radio and heliograph. Due to almost all the equipment on board being damaged or outright destroyed, McGonigal could only respond via an Altus lamp. The torpedo boat commanders had received a similar response before during the Suez Crisis from the Egyptian destroyer Ibrahim El Awal and assumed they were facing the Egyptian cargo ship El Qusayr and assumed a battle formation. As the torpedo boats approached, McGonigal ordered that one of the 50 cal machine guns be manned and open fire. However, after he gave the order, he saw the torpedo boats were flying the Israeli flag and ordered the machine gun to hold fire. Unfortunately, the order did not make it to the gun mount before a short burst had been fired. The torpedo boats launched 5 torpedoes at Liberty, one connecting with her hull, but miraculously hitting one of the strongest structural points on the ship, while severely damaging the ship and killing another 25 crew. Had the torpedo hit elsewhere, it would have likely caused irrecoverable damage to the ship. As the Israeli torpedo boats closed in, they fired their cannons, strafing the hull of the Liberty, and according to some, the crew of the Liberty, strafing damage control parties and crew making life rafts ready for launch. During the sea attack, one of the life rafts were recovered by the torpedo boats and found to have U.S. Navy markings. The torpedo boat circled the Liberty, saw her hull markings, but couldn't identify a flag. It took until 3:30 p.m. to confirm the identity of the ship, at which point the attack was called off.
When I was debriefed, I was told not ever to talk about it to anybody.
Around 4 p.m., Israel informed the U.S. through the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv that they had mistakenly attacked a U.S. ship. The patrol boats that attacked Liberty returned to offer assistance to her crew around 4:40, but the Liberty refused them. The Liberty herself was extensively damaged. Her superstructure was burnt and mangled, almost to the point of her being unrecognizable. Her keel was twisted, and she had a 39-foot by 24-foot hole in her side. Despite all of this, the crew managed to keep her afloat, and she traveled under her own power with an escort to Malta. After receiving repairs, she returned home to the U.S. and was later sold for scrap in 1973. Back in the U.S., the reception to the news of the attack ranged from disbelief to instant and unquestionable acceptance that the Israelis had simply mistook the ship. Initially, President Johnson believed that the Soviet Union was responsible. However, upon learning that it was Israel, he downplayed the incident, even changing the wounded and killed count from 34 to 10 and 171 to 100 in order to downplay the result of the attack in the United States. Captain McGonigal was awarded the Medal of Honor, which is normally presented to the recipient at the White House by the President, but in McGonigal's case was presented to him by the Secretary of the Navy at the Washington Navy Yard. Other crew did receive decorations for their actions that day, but one thing they all had in common was that there was no mention of Israel as the attacker in their citations.
Admiral Geis wants to see in his cabin. So Dave went up there, and Geis said, I want the senior officer off the Liberty to know this story, but I don't want you to ever repeat it until I'm dead or gone, because he said, I've got a naval career to protect. So he said, Geis looked at him and said, when Tully put up his planes, I radioed Washington, and he said, the next thing I knew, Secretary of Defense McNamara came on and said, recall the planes. And he said, he looked at Dave and said, I couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys. So the only thing I could think of is they thought maybe there were nuclear weapons on those planes. So he said, I told both the America and the Saratoga to bring up older planes from below that could only carry conventional armament. 90 minutes, an hour and a half after the attack started, put up a set of planes from each carrier, radioed Washington. McNamara came on and said, recall the planes again. He looked at Dave and said, I still couldn't believe they were going to abandon you guys, so I decided to push it. He said, I asked him to authenticate his message. Well, in the Navy, that means, does your boss agree with the orders you're giving me? And he said, the next thing I knew, Lyndon Johnson came on and said, recall the damn planes. I don't care who dies. I'm not going to embarrass my allies. So the White House left us for dead.
So what really happened that day, and why did it happen? That's the big question. Now, truthfully, we will probably never know with 100% certainty what happened that day, unless some damning evidence comes out that hasn't already been released in the past 60 or so years. It's highly doubtful that we'll ever 100% for sure know. We're going to go over a couple of the big theories that are circulated around this event, and then I'm going to give you guys my 2 cents on it at the end of this section. So, starting off, the first one is that Israel wanted to sink the Liberty and frame it on the Egyptians, thereby bringing the U.S. into the 6 Days War on Israel's side. Now, of course, the United States, we don't like when other countries mess with our boats, and that would be a pretty good way to get the Americans on your side if you're on one side of a conflict and the other nation that you're fighting against does sink an American boat with all hands. That will most definitely earn America's ire, and that seems to be one of the largest and most simple theories about this event. It went wrong when the Israelis failed to jam the Americans' SOS signal, and that did get to 6th Fleet, and that's why the Israelis were forced to call off the attack, although apparently it didn't get communicated to the torpedo boats, and they continued the attack until it could be fully called off. That's one of the biggest theories. The second theory is that Israel wanted to prevent the U.S. from listening in on their plans to invade Syria / take over the Golan Heights. The Johnson administration was opposed to both of those things, Israel invading Syria and Israel invading the Golan Heights. So the Israelis wanted to prevent the U.S. from learning of their plans, so they attacked the Liberty, since she was a spy ship after all, to prevent the U.S. from learning this. Now, this one, in my opinion, definitely makes the least sense out of the two. Why? Israel still did both things. Didn't matter that the Johnson administration was against it, they still did it. Maybe the Americans learning about that beforehand might have thrown a wrench in their plans, perhaps, but they still did it. So why go about sinking an entire U.S. naval vessel to prevent the Americans from learning about the actions that were going to be taking place there the next couple of days? Anyway, you can't really hide that from the Americans. And both of these theories have a couple of big holes in them. If the goal was to sink the Liberty, why did they stop? The Americans on board didn't relay any information to 6th Fleet that they were under attack from the Israelis. They just relayed the message that they were under attack by unknown jets. So there's no way that the 6th Fleet would have known that it was in fact the Israelis attacking the Liberty. In fact, the Liberty was also not where she was supposed to be. The order had been given to the Liberty that she was supposed to be 100 miles off of the coast. Now, that order was given very late in the night, early in the morning, June 7th, early June 8th, but with just the way that the message traveled, because of some administrative red tape and slowdowns, the message didn't make it to the Liberty until several hours after the attack. So, granted, the Israelis probably didn't know that, so the conditions were still right if the Israelis wanted to fully sink the ship and kill the crew for them to do that without the Americans ever knowing it was, in fact, the Israelis that had done so. So, why stop the attack if that's your plan? It doesn't make sense in my mind. That's the biggest hole in those two theories. Now, my opinion is that it's the result of a series of unfortunate events on the American side, and of a case of mistaken identity and lack of the proper identification procedures on the Israeli side. Like I just mentioned, the Americans had given the order, like I just mentioned, the Liberty was far closer to the coast than she should have been. Now, again, this isn't the fault of anyone aboard the Liberty. It just took that long for the message to get relayed from the United States through Sixth Fleet to the Liberty. There was a lot of communication going back and forth, and it just took too long to get to the Liberty. So she shouldn't have been there. And again, that's at no fault to the crew of the Liberty. That's just how it happened, unfortunately. On the Israeli side, they didn't do a thorough enough job in identifying the ship. The ship was flying an American flag before the first wave of jets attacked, at least. And again, according to the crew and according to everything that we have from the American side, they did put a bigger flag up after the first wave of jet attacks in order to, well, have their identification be known. Now, the second wave of jets did see a flag aboard the ship and did recognize the ship as an American ship, so they called off the attack. Now, you might be thinking, well, what happened with the torpedo boats? Well, after the second round of jets, the Israelis did send in helicopters to provide assistance to the Americans. And in fact, one of those helicopters did see an American flag aboard the ship. When the torpedo boats approached, the second unfortunate event from the American side was the firing of the 50 caliber guns. Now, McGonigal had ordered that one of the guns be made ready to fire and to fire. But once he saw that the torpedo boats approaching were Israeli flagged boats, he gave the order to hold fire. Despite the order being given, it didn't get to the gun mount in time before a short burst of fire was released from that gun mount. But there was also a second gun mount that opened up at the same time too. Now, there's been a confusion about the second mount opening up. It appears that it could have been either a sailor opening up on the approaching torpedo boats as well, or it could have been the ammunition cooking off because, well, the ship had been struck with napalm and was actively on fire, and that could have cooked off the ammunition for the mount, causing a short burst to be fired from the gun, or there was a sailor at the gun manning it that fired a short burst when the other mount opened up, but because of the spreading fire, he abandoned the mount, and that's another point of confusion with this whole scenario. So naturally, when the Israeli torpedo boats are waiting for the ship to identify itself, they receive a signal that they interpret as a similar signal from an Egyptian ship that they had dealt with in a prior conflict, and then you have machine gun fire from the ship directed at your torpedo boats. Naturally, in the middle of a war, you're going to assume that it is a hostile ship. And now this ship is firing at you, you're in a war, you're off the coast of Egypt, off the coast of the Sinai, the ship's firing at you now. You do unfortunately throw caution to the wind and assume it's a hostile ship and go on about your attack. And they did stop once they had fished the lifeboat out of the water. Now, there is a bit of a monkey wrench in this theory as well, because supposedly the order was given to the torpedo boats to stand down, but the commander didn't get it, or either wasn't paying attention and didn't get the message, or he ignored it. That's still up for debate, but that seems to be, in my opinion, what probably happened. A series of unfortunate events, and the Israelis simply not following the proper identification protocols because of the nature of the conflict that they were in. If you look at Egypt, Egypt lacks what's called tactical depth. It's a very small country, and when you're at war with all of your neighbors at once, you can't really afford to play it too cautiously. You can't afford to give up ground. You have to be aggressive. I'm not saying this just because it's Israel. I'm just saying this from a tactical point of view. If you look at a country like, let's say, Russia, Russia's a great example of this. In World War II and in the Napoleonic Wars, Russia could give up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of land and still have plenty more country that they could fall back into, and it worked out both times for them. Israel can't do that because of how small it is, so they have to be very aggressive in their tactics. That's just the doctrine that they have to follow. And when you apply this doctrine to, well, all aspects of the Israeli military, and then combine that with fatigue with the pilots, because they were flying sorties pretty much 24/7, with 24/6 in this case, you can see how this incident unfortunately happened. In my opinion, what really fuels the more conspiratorial side of things is the lack of response from the American government. The American government didn't really do anything to Israel because of this. Now, the Israeli government did in 1968 pay about $3.3 million to the government in compensation for the families of the 34 men that were killed in the incident, which is about $28 million in 2023 money. And then in 1969, they paid $3.6 million, which is about $28.5 million in 2023 money, to the men that had been wounded. And then they paid another $6 million in 1980, which is about $21 million in 2023 money, as final settlement for the damages to the Liberty herself, with 13 years of interest on top of it. And they did, of course, officially apologize for the incident. From the American side of things, not much happened. Like I mentioned earlier, Johnson did downplay the event, in fact, and they did, the men that received medals and commendations for their actions that day, their medals and commendations, the citations, did not mention Israel as the aggressor nation. So one big question that comes out of that is, well, why? Why does Israel get this special treatment from the American government after they attacked the Liberty, either deliberately or mistakenly? Why was there so little response? Well, it's the Cold War. It's the middle of the Cold War, 1967. At this point, the Soviets and the Americans, they are trying to get every single country in the world that they possibly can to be on their side. If you look at some of the countries and the leaders that America propped up during the Cold War, they did a hell of a lot worse than this to not only their people, but in general, like, you look at South Vietnam's president, whoo boy, yeah. There's a reason the Buddhist monks were burning themselves alive, alright? And we put up with it. Why? Because they wouldn't join the Soviets. They wouldn't be communist. So, if you take a look at the broader picture of what was going on around the world at this time, it's, yeah, no wonder the Americans didn't go to war with Israel or completely cut Israel off from everything else at this time. America wanted allies or puppet states where they could get it. Didn't matter what you did, who you were, as long as you weren't communist. Soviets did the exact same thing. So, in the bigger picture of the Cold War, it's, yeah, I can see how the United States would let this slide and not make a big fuss because, well, you still have Israel as an ally in the Middle East when the Soviets are trying to expand their sphere of influence into the Middle East as well. So, when you take it out of the vacuum of this one incident and look at the bigger picture, I can see how, yes, this was allowed to slide. But of course, many others can't, and they try to point to some bigger conspiracy theory, which might be true. I'm just giving you my 2 cents on this subject matter as a social studies teacher and as someone that's been reading about this for the past couple of weeks. However, again, that is just my opinion. I'm not saying it is fact. I'm not saying it is the truth. I'm just saying that's what appears to have happened from my research here in the past couple of weeks. I could be wrong. It could have been to cover up the planned invasion of the Golan Heights in Syria. It could have been because the Israelis wanted to draw the U.S. into the war. The point of the matter is, we won't know for sure, and there's nothing we can be certain about. What I do believe most of us can be certain about is that it's absolutely tragic that 34 of the Liberty's crew never got to go home to their families, and no matter of compensation monetarily or apologies can bring them back. Memorial is held every year on June 8th to remember the fallen of the Liberty. May they all rest in peace.